cart and dragging it from city to city. So it's really important they were able to make this compromise and make the decision to move here. And they sent L'Enfant here to plan the city, and I described his plan, but he brings Washington here and shows him the hill, and they choose to put our national symbol on that hill because of the vista to the west. And they decide to put the Congress in it. That's because Congress is Article 1 in the Constitution. The Constitution is 3.5 pages, and the first 2 pages list all the powers of the government and give them to the Congress. It's only at the bottom of the second page, more than halfway through the document, you finally get to the president, and he gets half the third page. So they told us how our government is supposed to work by putting Congress up high on a hill and the White House down low. It's on a little ridge so it didn't flood, but that's as high as they wanted it. And they were giving us a message about how our government is supposed to work. But you know, if you were to get a White House tour, they wouldn't tell you that. So they decided to have a contest to design the building because there were no architects practicing in the United States. L'Enfant could probably have designed it, but he was gone and out of favor anyway. And so they just threw the contest open to anybody. They democratized architecture, but it made it voluntary. People chose to participate in the contest. And the guy who won the contest was a medical doctor from Tortola in the British Virgin Islands, and he was in Thornton. But Thornton was a Quaker, so he had ties in Philadelphia, and that's how he learned about the contest. So they make the decision to put the Capitol here, and little by little it grows, and we'll talk about that when we get up closer and you can see the parts of it. But you can see there are 3 office buildings here. These are the 3 Senate office buildings. There are 3 House office buildings on the other side. And one of the interesting things about those buildings is, as far as I can find, those are some of the only legislative buildings in the world where you can walk in without an appointment.
Yay!
I can't find any others. Most state capitals you can't do that. And there's a reason for that. It may not be what you think. Because of that openness, and that's an obsession with us, is this openness. Anybody in the world can walk in there, and that means every member of Congress has to have their own receptionist. And that is 541 taxpayer-paid receptionists on duty in those 6 buildings. They all have to go to lunch. So on any working day, there are 1,082 taxpayer-paid receptionists on duty in those 6 buildings so that we have the feeling of access and contact with our members of Congress. You don't do that in state legislatures because they don't want to have to employ all those receptionists. And most states, the legislators aren't hanging out in the state capitol very long anyway.
Yeah.
But that is that gives you a sense of the scale of our pretensions to openness. You're not actually going to see that member of Congress, but you're going to see a member of their staff.
Yeah.
And they are responsible to you as a voter. And that's not true in other systems. We have a different view of representation than they do in other countries. In most countries, they have a parliament, and in the parliamentary system, the members are responsible to the party, and the party is responsible to the people. So the dialogue is supposed to go on between the party and the people, not the members. So the individual member isn't supposed to be communicating with his constituents directly.
Wow.
He's supposed to communicate with them through the party.
Wow.
Here, we don't even let the parties choose their own candidates. Nobody else in the world has primaries the way we do. We have spread power out so we keep even the parties from getting any power. So every member of the House gets 18 paid staff positions. A senator from a small state gets 25. Ranging up to the senators from California who get 75 staff members apiece.
Wow.
Now, there are 36 million people in California. 75 staff is not a lot. California's bigger than most countries. But the scale of this far exceeds any other legislative body in the world. Now, we know that several of those are receptionists. And you've got a chief of staff who's responsible for knowing what all the others are doing. So what are all the other people doing? Why do they need all those people? It's for this dialogue that doesn't take place in other countries. One of the former members of Congress that I work with was stationed in Rome for a while. And he and his neighbor were talking about a commuting problem that they had that could be solved in public works. And so he said to the neighbor, why don't you go to your member of parliament to try to get this resolved? And the neighbor said, why would I do that? That's not his job. He'll just send me to the same bureaucrats I'm dealing with. Because that kind of representation within the bureaucracy is not a function of a parliamentary member. Only in the United States do we assign that function to Congress. It's not a legislative function anywhere else in the world. So we've made a fundamentally different approach to representation. And what have we accomplished with that? Well, stability. There's all this complaint that Congress doesn't do anything. That's not their job to do anything. Their job is to reflect the country. It's their job, as one former member puts it, to take 320 million opinions and sort them out to yes or no on each bill. And that's confusing and chaotic. We have a 5-minute news cycle, so the angle on the news changes every 5 minutes. It's really hard to keep track of what's going on. So can you give me a positive synonym for chaos?
Congress. Congress.
Well, most people don't consider that positive.
Oh.
But you're on the right track.
Positive synonym.
Let's
Debate.
take another word that would help you understand Congress.
Free speech.
Speech is one, yeah. Try democracy. In democracy, you have no order. Everybody's equal. And therefore, if you look at it from this side, it's democracy, but if you look at it from this side, it's chaos. It's the same thing. And that's the system that we have created.
Well, anarchy's chaos. It's yours as long as you can stay awake. Democracy is first come, first served, line up. So
Democracy is a wonderful institution, except when you're standing behind it in line. Anyway, so let's get a historic perspective. What we have accomplished in 230 some years now. I would suggest that dome is the most recognized architectural object in the world. There are more people that know that dome and know what it stands for, and above all, believe in what it stands for, than any other building ever built. That's why I call this tour the most famous building.
Allah Akbar. Hi.
224. So, in that period, this dome has become famous. And I would suggest that it is what takes place in there, the stability of a democracy. So that any tin-horn dictator can address the United Nations. But the highest honor of elected government is to come and speak to a joint meeting of the U.S. Congress. You think about it, when they have a free and fairly fair election in Liberia, the most free and fair election in African history. They elect a woman, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Where does she come to celebrate that election for the whole world? Not the United Nations.
Yeah, I invited the PLO to debate their stance or something around this area, but nobody accepted the idea.
Yep. And they don't have a reputation for being democratic.
They had some elections or something, though, a few years ago.
Yes, and we invited them here, but we weren't quite ready. But when they had a revolution in Ukraine, they had an election, and the people of Ukraine felt that it was not fairly done. They delayed 2 weeks giving the results, and when they announced the results, nobody believed them. They knew that they'd been trying to figure out what to do when the wrong guy won. And so they turned out in the square in Kiev, 100,000 people wearing orange, called it the Orange Revolution. And they stared down the Russian government and their own government, and they held a fair election, and Yushchenko was elected. So where did he come to celebrate that election? Here, halfway around the world, is where you come to celebrate the triumph of democracy. It hasn't necessarily held that triumph in Ukraine. But I was telling this same talk one night at a banquet, and at the table with me was a former senator, Conrad Burns. And he said, I want to tell you what it was like to be in the House chamber when Lech Walesa came. Were you here? He talked about the fact that Walesa was so short that you couldn't see him as he walked down the aisle.
Right.
And you had to look between the congressmen and the senators all crowding around. And you could see the tears coming down his cheeks. Because he knew he was there standing for all of Polish history. Coming here to celebrate the triumph of elected governments in Poland. They had, the members of Congress had been told that he didn't speak any English, and so he was going to address them in Polish, which he did. But he got up to the platform, and they'd even had to put a box there because he was too short. And it took him a long time to get control over his emotions because he understood the symbolism of what he was doing there. And here was a man who was pretty much unqualified to be president of Poland. I mean, what he had done was, in front of his assembled co-workers, they had watched him be beaten by the guards, by the soldiers, and thrown over the fence. And his co-workers had watched him get up and walk back in to be beaten again.
Wow.
And they elected president of the union for that. And he organized well enough that they stared down the greatest empire in the world, and it went poof, suddenly. And there was no one to be president of Poland. So even though he knew he wasn't qualified, and everybody agrees he made a terrible president of Poland, he was there symbolizing, embodying Polish history. And he got to come here and stand up there. And so he showed them that he had learned 3 words of English. We the people.
Wow.
So that is what this building has come to stand for in its history. And that's what makes it the most famous building in the world, because there are more people that believe in elected government and its function, that have understood that deal that Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison made was a landmark in the development of the human species. And the epitome of it is here. So when the Pilgrims came, and the Puritans, they were going to set up a city set on a hill for the whole world to see the example of how things should be run. Now, if they knew what we have done, they would hate it. It was not at all what they intended. But we have developed here and come out with what is, in fact, the city set on a hill, which is this building. This is what the Pilgrims wanted. And we have achieved it in this building. Example for the whole world. Any thoughts about that?
Well, it was originally Jenkins Hill, right?
No.
No, okay.
It was never Jenkins Hill.
Okay.
We had a historian look into it.
Ah,
There are no references. There's only one reference to its ever being called Jenkins Hill, and that is L'Enfant's report.
ah,
And he referred to it because he and Washington had apparently met Jenkins here.
ah,
So it was never called Jenkins Hill. And the Carroll family that owned it is still campaigning. Have you met Charles Carroll Carter? They're working on resolutions in Congress to thank the Carroll family and point out that Jenkins rented for a few months a house from the Carrolls, and nobody ever called it Jenkins Hill. So this is their big thing, is getting the Carrolls the credit. It didn't have a name; they can't find one. And I was talking to Carroll Carter about it, and he said, "Well, you know, can't we call it Carroll's Hill?" I said, "But they didn't call it Carroll's Hill. You can't go back and, you know, you've got to find some kind of a historic citation before you can say that it was Carroll's Hill. We call it Capitol Hill now. There's no reason to change the name, but in fact it never was Jenkins Hill. That's kind of a joke."
Did eminent domain play a role in the conversion to a government area?
No, it was voluntary. The proprietors who owned the land, George Washington got them together and he got them all to agree to donate their land if they would be allowed to retain every other lot, so that they would be compensated by the sale of the lots, but the government would sell every other lot, and the government would get money and the proprietors would get money and everybody would be happy. But the lots didn't sell for very much money, and they had to, in order to get any money at all, they had to sell huge blocks of them to speculators, and so it didn't work out at all. Any other questions? Okay, let's move on. Good morning, Brian.
Good Mecca. Hi.
Your name was William?
Yes.
Yeah. Brian, this is William. How are you?
Hi, Brian. Okay, thanks. How are you? Mecca, come here. Good to meet you.
Yeah.
Brian.
And this is Eric. He's going to be volunteering with us for a couple of days.
Brian, Eric, and Jay. Brian, sister. And Sarah.
Helms and Denver.
You want to go hunting? Come on, Mecca. No time to hunt right now.
Probably won't remember, but if you do, tell him you met Jay. Okay, I will. Pretty well. I only took 2 trips in my entire life. Oh, okay.
Perfect. Find the squirrel, Mecca. Now heel.
Yeah. And his wife is, it's been a long time. I don't know if I'm not really sure about that.
Good, Mecca. Heel.
No. Actually, we're going from Charlotte to Raleigh. So. Yeah. I hope they come back down here 2 hours. No, really. Yeah. You got to do that sometimes. People tell me it's shorter than that. Shoot.
Don't hate me. Loggers football. Hi, be brave and be fair, right? Be brave and be fair.
Now this is the Carrere and Hastings building that was designed along with Union Station. It wasn't finished until 1909. But as you can see back here, it uses a motif that's interesting. You have paired columns. You get the same thing on the Cannon building. The paired column motif comes from the Louvre, the 1870s edition of the Louvre in Paris. They used that to make the colonnade a little bit less overwhelming. So anybody that knows the history of architecture knows those paired columns come from the Louvre. And that identifies that Carrere and Hastings went to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, as did McKim. The second building, this is 1909. The second building is 1958, but it was designed quite a bit earlier. And there you can see the white columns, not in pairs, but between the columns is actually bronze window frames. But you still get the feel of the columns between the two buildings. The third building is international style. And between those columns is glass. But again, you're carrying the motif of columns there, simpler and simpler. And this is a continuum of American architecture, going back to Henry Steele Commager's commentary on Beaux-Arts architecture and our importing European ideas. And here we are, we have a continuum of American architecture. Now you can call that progress or decline depending on your perspective. But there it is.
Come on, Mecca.
When did you say Dirksen was built, Steve?
58.
That's a long time after London. The second.
No, the trade-off for Longworth was completing the fourth side. Russell, C-shape originally. On that side, on the other side with the arch and so forth, that's later.
Is that identical to Cannon? I'm almost identical to Cannon.
Graduated with
No, it is not, because it was C-shaped and Cannon was a square.
And you're, are you a rising senior this year, or did you just graduate? Oh, okay.
Yeah, let's look over at the Russell building here. You see the first two windows on the second floor, just to the right of the tree there. Those were Lyndon Johnson's office. Probably the best biography ever written about anybody in all of human history is Robert Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson. 4 volumes so far. He's been working 35 years on it. This is the first biography where the biographer has recorded telephone conversations of the man's whole career, after a certain point, at any rate. From this point on in his career, after the 4th book, all of his telephone conversations, you get his tone of voice. Nobody has ever been so documented as Lyndon Johnson. Robert Caro has access to that, and so you can understand. He also is a marvelous biographer. The Master of the Senate, the 3rd volume, is the one that explains about this, and it is the best book about the Senate as far as I'm concerned. Have you? I assume you've read it. His description of the way the Senate works, his history of the Senate, to me is better than anything else.
Robert Caro,
made me understand.
Master of the Senate.
Well, he uses this office, which Johnson got, to show how Johnson rose in power. Johnson had arrived in Washington under a cloud. He was elected by 30 votes in the Democratic primary in Texas, and that was enough to get the election. There was one precinct in the valley of the Rio Grande where 80 people voted in alphabetical order with the same handwriting. And Lyndon Johnson carried that precinct by 50 votes and carried the primary by 30 votes. So, needless to say, they called him Landslide Lyndon, and he arrived as probably the least prestigious senator. But he understood power. He'd already been a congressman, and he didn't do well there. But here he understood, and so he wanted that parking space under the tree there. And there were more senior senators that parked along here, but he was the one who cared enough about the details that he would intimidate and cajole the guards to keep that parking space for him, even though more senior senators parked along here, because they didn't care about the details. So he knew that nobody wanted to be on the administration committee. Is the least prestigious committee in the Senate. Nobody wants to be on it. And so he chose that because he knew they controlled the parking spaces, and the office space, and all the nitty-gritty stuff. And he used that to rise in power faster than anyone else has ever become majority leader. We've only had majority leaders for 150 years anyway. But he rose faster than anybody else because he understood power and how to wield it and how the little details can be built. And I would suggest that he has distorted our entire view of American history. Because for a short period in the 1950s and 60s, the Senate worked in an entirely different way than it ever has since. And really more into the 60s. The 50s it was stuck. But Johnson was rising in power, and he understood it, and he knew how to play the forces off each other. and he made the Senate work, and he made a whole generation, a whole period of people believe that the Senate is supposed to work that way. And the fact is, for all of its history, it never worked that way. And Robert Caro is really good at explaining that we have this illusion of how things are supposed to be. And it still carries over now, saying Congress is dysfunctional. Go look at the 50s. Look at the 20s. In 1920, the Congress was unable to agree on a reapportionment of the House. And so we went for 20 years with no reapportionment, which is why the House went so suddenly from Republican to Democrat in 1930, because we hadn't reapportioned in 1920. And look at the whole history of the Congress, and you never have another period except those few years when there were hardly any Democrats in the Congress during the Civil War. And Matt Wisniewski is writing about that, and how that was probably the most productive Congress in American history. And we have the illusion that Congress is supposed to accomplish all these things. That's a progressive bias. In fact, the Congress is supposed to reflect the country. And for most of our history, we've had great struggles making decisions. But Lyndon Johnson gave us this illusion for a little while that we could accomplish a lot. And ever since, we believe that's the way things are supposed to be and the way they always were. But now they're really dysfunctional. They're not. But Lyndon Johnson had that office up there. There's a plaque on the inside now, indicating all the presidents get plaques inside if they were senators. They show where their offices were. But with that parking space shows you how Lyndon Johnson acquired power, understood it, really like nobody else in our history. So any thoughts about that?
He was always looking for Lady Bird's approval. I read that he would call her after speeches and stuff and say, "How did I do?" Is that true?
On that level, yes. But the illusion that Lady Bird was any kind of a power, Caro has completely wiped out. Because he proves that even when he was president, Johnson still had a phone. There was a direct line to that television station that he said Lady Bird was running, but she really had nothing to do with running. She owned it on paper. Now you see that what looks like a bronze tombstone out there in the middle there next to the light post. That is a plaque that commemorates the fact that George Washington built 2 houses there. After he left the presidency, he wanted to contribute to development. He was really a developer at heart. And so he bought 2 of the lots there. He had to buy 2 because he had to get 1 proprietor's lot and 1 government lot so that everybody was treated fairly. That's the epitome of George Washington. And so he built 2 houses there. By the time he died, they were neither rented nor sold, but they were the grandest houses in the neighborhood. And eventually a young naval officer bought them both. And he got the assignment of taking care of the clocks for the Navy. His name was Charles Wilkes, and he wanted to live here because he knew the only way he was going to get to go on this great exploring voyage that he wanted to make so he could make history was to lobby the Congress. So he locates here, and they give him the assignment of taking care of the clocks. Well, clocks are crucial in the Navy at that point because that's how you calculate a longitude. You'd have a clock that was set to Greenwich time, and then you would take a sighting on the sun at exactly noon and calculate what the difference was. Well, then you had to know how inaccurate that clock was. And so he was in charge of the office that did that, and he knew the only way to do it really accurately was an observatory, and so he built an observatory on the top of those 2 houses. When they promoted him to go on to do other things and he became an explorer, the Navy had to take on that clock function that he had been doing very well. And so they knew they had to have an observatory here, and so they built one out along the river. In fact, where Thomas Jefferson thought we ought to have the Capitol at the end of Constitution Avenue. But they didn't pay attention to the fact that even at that point, that neighborhood was known as Foggy Bottom. And you didn't want an observatory there. And the observatory is still there, but eventually they realized they had to build a better one, so they built it out on Massachusetts Avenue. That's the origin of the naval observatories on the top of those 2 houses there. Now, they were much lower than this. They were fairly close to the stream bed which runs under Louisiana Avenue there. So there's much below that. This is all filled land.
Come on, Mecca, heel. Perfect strength, Mecca. Good, Mecca. Now heel. Perfect heel, Mecca. Good, Mecca. Good, Mecca. Memorize and outgrow those cigarettes until you find.
Remnant of the construction project for the visitor center, because when they excavated for the visitor center, they obliterated the place that the congressmen like to give their press conferences best. So they built one here. There's a wooden platform here with places for groups of adoring people to stand and a TV camera. And then they would keep a lectern out here so that the TV camera was just at the right angle to get the dome behind somebody as they made their big announcement. So in fact, when I had groups coming by here, I'd have them pose there saying, and then I told the president. But they left the electrical connections here, and those actually plug into TV lines out there. So I assume that eventually they're going to build something more permanent here, because I have not taken out the slab after that. But the wooden platform was deteriorating, so they removed it. Correct.
Okay, here's the dome.
In the winter and in the hot summer, they would give press conferences on the balcony. Get a camera angle of the Capitol in the background. Here you get a sense of the hill. That stream was much lower here, and but this is the path of Tiber Creek.
Down, yeah.
The stream is underneath Constitution Avenue. It was turned into a canal. Originally it was called East Street. The guy who planted the plantation north of here that did the American building was named Pope. And he thought if he was going to have a plantation, he named it the New Rome, and he changed the name of the creek to the Tiber Creek. Nowadays it developed the Tiber, like in Rome. And nowadays, of course, they call it Tiber River, even though it's only a creek. But from even before the time when the government chose to move here, there were pretentious ideas going on. Now, L'Enfant wanted to turn the thing into a canal, which they eventually did, but only after they had brought all the materials here that L'Enfant wanted to bring in the canal. So the canal was an economic failure, but what little industry Washington ever had developed along the canal there. But they discovered that, of course, the tide goes up and down a lot in the river. And here you get a sense of it. Of course, at the end of the street here, those buildings are all in green. But the tide went up and down. That affected the water in the creek. So they had to build a structure to hold the water in the creek. And they called it the water gate. And that's the origin of that term. It had been extended out when they filled in the land over there. And somebody built a restaurant along the Potomac. When my family came here in 1959, we had Sunday dinner at the Watergate restaurant there. Probably the most famous restaurant in town. later on somebody bought the property and put up the development and called it the Watergate. That was because it was the restaurant called the Watergate, which was named after that structure which had long disappeared on the canal.
We had concerts on those steps. My wife would do the
Oh, yeah.
Come on, we'll boat.
There was a whole barge out there on the stage and everything, but then when jets came into National Airport, the jet disrupted the concert. Let's go over here.
Here's some black SUVs here. Perfect side-by-side partners to and from God. Who? Oh, the food is what you're interested in. Here, let's get you in the shade, Mecca.
In the shade.
Here.
The dress code.
I don't know if you had gotten
Oh,
one
thanks.
of those.
The most famous building in the world.
Brochure about the grounds.
Oh, thanks. United States Capitol and grounds. Very well done. Wow.
We'll talk about Olmsted some more as we go down the hill. But we got as far as Washington choosing the site and the decision to put the Congress in here. The contest to design the building. This is Dr. Trumpen's design. He took the Pantheon in Rome, the most famous round room in the world, right in the center there.
You
He
been
put
there?
two wings on. Yes.
Fabulous. Good century. Go Sandy.
Yeah. So it's the most famous round room in the world, and so he put that in the center. He just put two wings on it. But those wings also reflect the Constitution. They decided to put the Congress in here because the Congress is Article 1 in the Constitution. And in the convention there were two factions. One group that felt they were representing the states, and the states were building the national government, and that was the essential relationship, and it should be equal. But there were other people who felt, no, it's the people that need to have the ultimate loyalty to the government. And so we need to count the number of people in each state, at least, and represent that. They couldn't come to a decision, couldn't get a majority, and finally one state was ready to stomp out of the convention. Failure. When somebody said, oh, let's just do both. Now, some of the states already had state governments with bicameral legislatures and so forth, so it wasn't out of the blue. But basically, they saved the convention by what we call the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. Connecticut is the state that proposed it. And that's how we got a House and a Senate. Now, from the beginning, the House was 3 times the size of the Senate. But they're equal in power, so they get equal space in the building. Now, you can see the center part here in your view with the round window and the arched window below it, with no pillars in front. If you can think of that and the equal part on the other side, those are the first 2 parts of the building. Now, there were no architects practicing in the United States. So as I said, the democratized architecture by throwing the contest open to anybody. And it's won by a medical doctor. But he doesn't know anything about constructing buildings. And furthermore, what he designed, what you've got in your hand there, was the biggest building in North America. And the first major stone building in the United States. We have no quarries that anybody's used to test the stone because we haven't actually structurally constructed a building out of it. And there were no contractors who had ever handled a construction project of this scale. And nobody had any experience building stone buildings. We didn't know anything more about architecture than we did about democracy. And so we had to experiment around. Now they needed those two wings first, but nobody knew what they were doing anyway, so they let two separate contracts. And the guy that was building the house wing made his foundations too weak. It began to collapse in construction. So they abandoned it because they had only 10 years to get the city ready. 5 years were gone already. They knew they were way behind. And so they built only the Senate wing. And this is what it looked like. This is what they moved into after 10 years of construction. And that's what you're looking at, the design right here in the center of your view. See the round window and the arch window below. They had to rush the construction to get it ready after 10 years because, in particular, the Congress had already planned that Capitol on the Delaware River, but it wasn't ready, it was falling behind, and so they just abandoned it. So they knew that the Congress wouldn't have any trouble abandoning this location as well. There was a lot of opposition to it. But they knew they had to get that building ready. And they move into it and the roof leaked and the floors creaked, and they came to understand why you need an experienced architect. Furthermore, they had looked around for stone, no quarries, except for a little decorative stone. And the nearest one they found was on a quiet creek down in Stafford County. And so looked like good stone to them, so they brought it up here, but it is sandstone. I had a stone contractor on a tour a few years ago, and he said, wait a minute, you can't build a building of this scale out of sandstone, it won't hold up. And I said, well, you're correct, but we didn't know that. So we built the building out of poor quality stone. But they proceeded with this. Now, 10 years of planning and construction, a failed building. But an architect moved to America at that point. Henry Latrobe saw the opportunities in the market here, moved here and made friends with Jefferson. And so they hired him to decide what to do with this failed building. Well, he pointed out that they put the Senate chamber on the ground floor for easy access, when if you look at that building, you expect the major rooms to be on the second floor, because in that era, you always built the major rooms on the second floor for air circulation reasons. But only an architect would know that. So he said, we've got to move the Senate chamber up to the second floor. But they said, we'll build the House chamber, the one that we've abandoned, rebuild that, and then we'll come back and do that. So they did that, and by that point it's 1809, the end of the Jefferson administration. And they're out of money. And they just built a wooden walkway in between those two separate buildings. And that's what it looked like 5 years later in 1814 when the British came and burned it. Now if you'll turn that drawing over, that is what the building looked like at that point. It says Capitol in ruins, that's after the fire of 1814. But let's look back here for a moment at what they were trying to do. This is Latrobe's plan. Latrobe is the architect, so they hire him, and of course he's not going to accept the work of another architect. There's lots of problems with it, including putting the chamber on the ground floor. So what he was going to do is move the chambers up, and then in order to get the people up, he adds that staircase. Go back to Thornton's drawing. And you see there's no staircase because he was putting the floors on the major rooms on the ground floor. But Latrobe needs to get the people up, and so he created those staircases. And that is why those staircases are so important to you, is because Latrobe wanted us walking up those stairs. He wanted this symbol that says, a lot of people are expected here and they're welcome. So when they added the wings on the end, they tripled that message with 3 different staircases, but of course, now we have to block them.
Yeah.
But the symbolism is still there that this building is supposed to be inclusive. And those staircases really affect you psychologically as you look at the building. You've got the great dome there, which of course dominates, but the staircases next to that are probably the most evocative thing about the building. Now compare the 2 domes between Latrobe and L'Enfant, or Thornton. Thornton took the dome right off the Pantheon, but it was too small for such a large building. And so Latrobe felt it was too abrupt between the kind of squarish building and this spherical dome, and so he put it up on an octagon. So he's still got the spherical dome, but he's put an octagon underneath it to kind of mediate between the square and the round. But that dome was never built. But because he's moved the chambers to the 2nd floor, he comes up with these skylights on each end for the 2 chambers, because he's moved them to the 2nd floor. Those are there, but you can't see them from this side. You'll see them from the other side. So this is the building that they're building, but he only gets as far as the 2 wings because they had stopped construction with the wooden walkway. But after the fire, then they've got to reconstruct. So they hired Latrobe again, but they put cost controls on it. And Latrobe was an artistic personality. He couldn't stand being confined by a budget. And besides that, the guy that they put in charge of it was one of these green eye shade guys who questioned everything. And Latrobe was so offended this man did not understand the great art that he was trying to build, that things got bad enough that President Monroe tried to mediate between the 2 of them. So they have a meeting in the White House, and Latrobe became so angry at this green eye shade accountant bookkeeper that he jumped up and grabbed him by the throat. You know, "You're ruining the Capitol!" And Monroe thought that Latrobe had gone crazy, and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And Latrobe realized. And so they decided that perhaps Latrobe needed to move on. So he went to the great boom city of the era, New Orleans, where he caught yellow fever and died. So that's where he's buried. But he has contributed this concept of a great building. Now, the other great architect in the country at that point is Charles Bulfinch. He has finished the state capitol in Boston. And so they hired him to finish this capitol. And this is what it looked like. This is a photograph, one of the earliest known photographs of the Capitol building, the way Bulfinch finished it. You can see he used the Latrobe skylights on each side and created the arched ceilings there, but he didn't put the little caps on it. And he made a much bigger dome. They called it an upside-down salad bowl, and people made fun of it all the time. But it was a wooden dome, and if you turn that over, there's a picture of the model that's over in the Hart building now that shows you there was a stairway up the back, and you could go in there and climb up and walk around the oculus at the top, which was glassed over. At one point they had a fire in the Library of Congress, which is the part that sticks out in the middle there, and they actually they were so concerned with the dome being dry wood that they had to knock down that staircase suddenly to keep it from burning and carrying the fire to the dome. The dome never did burn, but they knew it had to be replaced. It was a fire trap. So that's the building as they finish it. The biggest building in North America when it was planned, first major stone building in the United States. But we planned it when we had 13 states and thought we might have 25, and by the time we finished the building, the country was 3 times the size it was when we started, and it was immediately too small. One little factoid you might appreciate. Between 1845 and 1850, Florida, Texas, and California all became states within 5 years. That is manifest destiny. We went from sea to shining sea.
Just the Mexican War.
Yes, yes.
The promised Utica.
Yeah. Wisconsin and Iowa also became states during that period. So we were expanding, and the members of Congress got no staff and no office. They had to use their desks, their offices, and there were no room for any more desks, and they realized they had to expand the building. So 1851, they bite the bullet and hire an architect, Thomas Walter, and we get the building that we have today. Put a wing on this end for the Senate, wing on the other end for the House, and then that wooden dome was going to look silly on such a big building, and everybody didn't like it anyway, and so they decided to take it off. They're going to have to replace it because it was dried out in a fire trap. They took it off and created this dome. They made it entirely of cast iron. No stone in the Capitol dome. Entirely painted iron. Did you know that in October they're going to cover it in scaffolding for 3 years?
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah. They're going to take all the paint off it, find all the little holes, fix them, and try to do a fairly permanent job of it. It'll just take 3 years, so it's supposed to be finished by the next inauguration. There's one of your umbrella ladies.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I've heard the story was Lincoln said, finish the dome, and so they did. Otherwise, it was sort of half undone.
That's a misinterpretation. Because what we know, Lincoln had nothing to do with the decision. But Lincoln received a letter complaining about the use of the iron, which was needed in the war effort. Lincoln justified the construction, but he didn't make the decision. Who made the decision?
Well, people the New York company sent the iron down here and said, hey, this thing's going to run.
And they were responsible for finishing it.
Yeah.
They had all the materials here, and they had deployed those plates for the dome around the Capitol grounds to hook up barricades in case somebody attacked Lincoln's inauguration. But there were pigs running wild in the city at that time. And they loved to pee on the iron, and that's acid. It was eating away the iron, so they couldn't leave the supplies here. And this is Kirtland Janney and Company out of Brooklyn. They knew that if the North and the South made any kind of an accommodation and agreed to separate, that Maryland would certainly secede and join the South. And this would not be in the United States anymore, and they wouldn't get paid. So they actually financed the construction of the dome. For a few months at the beginning of the Civil War, when the Congress cut off their payments, they went right on constructing because they were going to finish that dome and get their final payment before the country fell apart. So the contractor made the decision. I love to tell the story to contractors. The contractor's the one that saved the dome. So during the war, they finished the dome in 1863. And they put the statue up there. The dome was lit at that point by 1,000 gas lights. It must have been magical. There was no other building like that in the country. Most Americans would never have seen anything that glowed from the inside the way that dome did. And here we've been through this great nightmare of the war, and the guns are quiet, and the city's in a shambles, but in the middle of that war, we have completed this magnificent structure, certainly the most magnificent in the country. And it's there to symbolize the fact that we have completed the Union, we have saved it, and we're going to pick up the pieces and go on. It really does symbolize the Union, just like Lincoln said it did. But Carl Sandburg is the one that gave Lincoln the credit for that. Really deserve it. Any other questions about that? Homestead did a good job of providing trees here and a comfortable place to sit. He made sure that he put these dividers in here because he did not want you lounging here. He wants you sitting and waiting for the streetcar while you contemplate the Capitol. And he made sure that nothing was planted between here and the Capitol so that you are able to see the building as he wanted you to see it. That one tree is too far forward, so they're talking about moving it back because Homestead did not want a tree there. But he did want these bushes a little bit higher so you hide the vehicle. This is the delivery entrance. This is the outside. They wanted you to sort of see the Capitol there above let's see, I think he was still here in 61, about 62. That's when most of the street